I'm going to now hand over to our next speaker, who is Simon Harragin. Oh, by the way, Ashley is going to stay online and be listening to the other presentations, and we're going to bring him back in when we get to our question and answer session. Simon Harragin, who is on my far right here, authored the Jonglei South Sudan study, and he's an independent consultant and writer on anthropology and development issues. His research focuses on the delivery of aid and humanitarian emergencies in Sudan, South Sudan, and other countries in East Africa. And so I'd like to hand over to Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. As Niels hinted, we went into the local to global study not knowing quite what we would find, intentionally trying to keep an agenda open in a way which was actually quite unusual for a study. Having said that, we knew what we would be involved with would produce findings on protection. Obviously, calling yourself the local to global protection study was going to lead us in the direction of conclusions on protection. And we were obviously going to try to compare local views with global views. So we didn't actually go into this not knowing quite what we would find. We went into this knowing that we were going to restrict the study in a certain direction that was going to produce certain views that we probably already had before we went into the study. It was not as open-ended as we might claim it to have been. But one of the findings is that by being honest about the methodology and about the degree of prejudices one goes into studies like this with, we can help to try and really go over and understand things in a more local way rather than with a global perspective. Having spent a year looking at the problems in Jonglei from the end of 2009, 2010, it seems strange that now the recent events that have been happening in Jonglei have come to confirm all the findings and the views that local people were talking about over the year of the investigation. And in some ways, it's an important point to make that the more local the information, the more likely it is to be accurate, and the stronger predictive capacity it will have to predict events, to predict when famines are about to happen, to predict when violence is about to happen. And usually the people who know best about these things are local people, and that was that came through very strongly in the study. The other thing that came out through the study was in fact that outsiders are not protecting local people in South Sudan. Local people rely on themselves to a great extent for their own protection. They rely on themselves rather than the government of South Sudan, rather than UNMISS, rather than the international community. And it's important, and if you remember only one thing from the Jonglei presentation, is that they're responsible for protecting themselves, and that is in spite of the claims of many other parties to be protecting those people. It seems that protection it imparts a right to canonization on behalf of political leaders, whether that's the government of Sudan, government of South Sudan, or when it becomes a question of aid agencies or even protection actors from the Department of Peacekeeping. It seems to be a role that people like to play, to be seen as the protection actors. And so our study, this particular study in Jonglei on local to global protection, wants to try to investigate how protection is actually a very intangible and value-laden concept, depending on the point of view of whose point of view you're looking at. So if we start with the local point of view, on protection. As Neil said, we tried to look at what the local view of threats were, what their activities were, and then as the third thing, how they then viewed the roles of other protection actors working around them. So to start, the local view of threat. Well, the thing that in the local Dinka language that came up was a concept called rioch, and rioch is a vague word that refers essentially to bad things that might include disease, that might include hunger, that might include insecurity, that might and they are the things that the majority of the population is faced with, and it's therefore a thing that the majority of the population as a community seek to defend the community from. In particular, by building up local livelihoods against hunger, and then by using what means are available to local people to improve security. In the context of the villages that I've been working in South Sudan since about 1997, security in those places is now worse than it's ever been, even during the period of the war. Therefore, local protection activities in terms of security are we have to say, are unsuccessful. Local people said that when someone raids them with a gun, if the village has been disarmed, no one will dare to follow even one person if they don't have a gun themselves. Therefore, local protection activities in the context of the disarmament that happened in this part of Jonglei are unsuccessful. Therefore, the idea that local people have taken events into their own hands and rearmed is a natural response in some ways to the fact that they feel that they're being they have a threat which is coming from other groups, mainly in relation to livestock raiding. And they also feel that the protection that they're being given from the state, the government of South Sudan, and if it were capable of doing so, the UN peacekeeping force. When local people talked about protection, there were a lot of expressions in the local Dinka language to describe activities that people would undertake, including patrols and screeching and calling and drums and indicating when danger was coming along. But one of the most useful definitions actually came out from a workshop that we held in Juba, where people came down from the Nuba Mountains, which Justin will talk about later, and people also came out from Jonglei, and they came expecting that they would be given a workshop in how to do protection. And after about 2 days of the workshop, someone from Nuba stood up and he said, "Well, I've now realized that all work that you do to alleviate suffering is protection." He realized that we were not there to actually tell people what protection was about, but to try to ascertain what local concepts of protection were. And he continued to say that we're interested in the work we can do in prevention as much as in protection. So the local point of view of this particular person was to do with the prevention aspect of preventing rioch, these bad events from occurring in the first place. Now this is juxtaposed to the classic ICRC definition of protection as all activities aimed at obtaining the full respect for the rights, blah blah blah, which is the definition based on the proclaimed intentions of protection and its formal relations with the principles of international humanitarian law. But the second, the definition by the man from the Nuba Mountains, is about the functioning of protection. It has to function as a kind of protective structure, like a kind of a roof in some ways, and it's an instrumental definition. It's based around on essentially what will prevent the person from either being killed or dying of hunger, and thus protecting that person in a rather self-evident, obvious way, and it's not to do with how that structure is constructed. It's to do with what purpose that structure fulfills, and that was the important difference in the definition of the two things. And the humanitarian view of protection was seen as relying on a rule of law structure that, in the context of South Sudan at the moment, is non-existent and is unable to work as a thorough system, as a complete system to ensure that rights are obtained and that duty bearers are sanctioned. The local people then described what views of agencies were. 3 minutes. Okay. And the local view of the humanitarian process called into question in some ways some of the justificatory logic that aid agencies use for justifying their programs. I mean, just to give some examples, they talked about the question of sort of capacity building and said, well, you know, this sounds like we have no capacity in the first place, and if you're coming in to build our capacity, and if you're not present in the villages to ensure our security, this sounds a little bit hypocritical. In similar way, local people said, well, if you want to help us, provide us with guns, which seems logical from the point of view of the people not being ensured protection. And again, there is an aspect of protection which should be common sense. We obviously can't provide guns, but local people said that's what they needed to ensure protection. And sure enough, that's what they did. They went out and sold 7 cows and they bought a gun. And they rearmed. So in terms of the role that agencies should take as opposed to apropos of protection, the current role is one of gatekeeping. And in some ways, the international NGOs are occupying a far too greater place between the global and the local, with their justificatory logic and with their donor proposals and their coordination structures. They do occupy an enormous amount of place, which I think gets in the way of the donor community, the global community, talking to the local. I make 2 more points and then I finish. In terms of government, obviously the government is the first the first people who are responsible for security. They are not at the moment capable of providing security in the rural areas where this research was studied. The only way that they will be able to provide better security is if there's a closer relationship in the long term by building up outsiders working with the government rather than in the CPA period seeing the government as one party, and the relations of UNMISS to the government were to maintain neutrality rather than now as an independent country. There is no need to be neutral, and the best way of ensuring security is for UNMISS to work with the local authorities. And the implication of this for peacekeeping is that the disarmament that's being suggested at the moment for the Jonglei area might not actually be the best solution in terms of the security vacuum that exists. So everyone at the moment is saying disarmament, 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 but who's providing security? As long as there is a security vacuum and no one is providing security, then again the same thing is going to happen. In the context of the UNMISS not being seen by local people as a credible force to provide security. So in conclusion, the way of accessing local voice, I said, is extremely difficult. And I would hesitate to claim that this study has been successful in going local. But I would say that these kinds of studies that try to ascertain local points of view find that they're coming up against an information vacuum about the way local people work, think, and act. And in the context of this vacuum, they're filling it with essentially value-laden points of view. Most humanitarian inquiry contains substantial baggage, and that's often due to the assumption that the humanitarian project and local people share a universal agenda, and that humanitarian concerns are also the concerns of local people. The current study has tried to leave the comfort zone of global programmatic policy making and to use local voice genuinely to challenge decision making rather than trying to iron out the differences between a local and a global perspective.